We're happy to present today on IRB Reliance. We have just passed the 1-year mark where we expanded our Reliance program to include the processing of industry-sponsored multi-center clinical trials to have that IRB review deferred to a commercial IRB. And we've had a very busy and active year, processing a large number of submissions and getting studies activated at UCLA. So today we thought it was a good idea just to do a refresher on what it means to have an IRB Reliance submission, where the regulatory background for that comes from. Then we'll focus on our most common submissions where we rely on an external IRB and received some excellent tips from Ryan and Gerard on processing those requests. And then we'll talk a bit about the other type of reliance that we see commonly when UCLA is a primary awardee for a federal grant or is running an investigator-initiated submission, where we serve as IRB of record and other institutions rely on us. So that's the kind of the breakdown for our presentation. We'll go ahead and get started. So while both DHSS and FDA regulations have always allowed for the designation of a single IRB to oversee multi-site collaborative research, the NIH single IRB mandate and the resulting revisions to the Common Rule 45 CFR 46 to require SIRB review for cooperative research, in addition to the 2016 21st Century Cures Act, really sought to alleviate administrative burdens that would in turn accelerate the development and delivery of scientific breakthroughs. In addition, UCLA anticipated FDA's adoption of a similar initiative to push for a single IRB review process and instituted a change in process for industry-sponsored multi-center clinical trials to rely on an external IRB. The use of a single IRB or SIRB for multi-site studies is an effort to minimize burden for our researchers and to reduce the duplication of efforts put into the IRB review process. So at UCLA, we allow reliance in a variety of situations. First and foremost, per the NIH mandate and the Common Rule requirement, federally funded non-exempt research protocols are under a single IRB mandate, meaning they don't have a choice if they're conducting collaborative research with domestic sites in the United States. So we would implement an SIRB review for those protocols. Again, as noted at UCLA, we expanded the SIRB review requirement for industry-sponsored multi-site clinical trials. And so under our current procedures, those are deferred for review to a commercial IRB. And then we also consider reliance for other submissions on a case-by-case basis, which may include investigator-initiated trials that are not federally funded or non-clinical trial but industry-sponsored studies such as long-term registries to track adverse effects after a drug has been approved and other kinds of safety studies. UCLA can serve as IRB of record or rely on an external IRB for federally funded non-exempt research. And as part of today's presentation, as I said, we'll be focusing on the more common scenario where UCLA requests to rely on an external IRB, and we'll later review situations and requirements when we serve as IRB of record. So some key terms related to reliance. The term single IRB or SIRB is directly from the NIH mandate, which indicates that the ethical review for all sites participating in a specific multi-site or cooperative study should be reviewed by one IRB. And so in that process, we select one IRB who will complete the regulatory review, and then each participating site accepts that review. They accept the protocol and they accept the consent form template that is approved by the lead IRB. We also often hear the term commercial IRB, and a commercial IRB can be a single IRB. A federally funded study can designate a commercial IRB to be a single IRB, but in many cases, Commercial IRBs serve as contracted IRBs that are not affiliated with an institution that are paid to complete the regulatory review required for human subjects research protocols. The reviewing IRB is the IRB that's designated to complete the required regulatory review for a multi-site protocol, including the initial review, modifications, continuing review, and evaluation of post-approval reportable events. And then the relying IRB are the participating sites or the sites that rely on the selective reviewing IRB for the required IRB review. They agree to follow the approved consent template and the approved protocol. Relying IRBs are responsible for completing a local context review, meaning that they review the protocol to make sure that its conduct will not violate any local or state policies at that site. At UCLA, we have a variety of reliance agreements that help to facilitate reliance. The most commonly used agreement is the SMART IRB agreement. This is a national agreement that was developed through the CTSI effort and has been adopted by many, many institutions across the United States, which is why it's our most common agreement. It alleviates having to execute a new reliance agreement with academic partners for future collaborations. It's used for the majority of our collaborations with academic partners, and most of our UC partners and CTSI partners, CEDARS, Drew, and Harbor UCLA have all transitioned into the SMART IRB. So for the most part, if you're working with an academic partner, we will direct you to utilize a SMART IRB agreement. We also have collaborative agreements with various research networks, such as StrokeNet, NCI-CIRB, the National Merrill Donor Program, and RAT. And these collaborative agreements set up a long-term collaboration where we don't have to go back for each study and negotiate terms of reliance. So this is very similar to SMART IRB, but generally these agreements are specific to certain types of research and certain categories of research. We also have master agreements with commercial IRBs. For example, we have master agreements with Advara and WCG IRB that outline the procedures and the process by which we can rely on their review and what checks they will perform versus the checks that we will perform. Sometimes you may be collaborating with an academic partner that is not participating in SMART IRB. And in that case, they do have their own IRB, and we can set up an IRB to IRB authorization agreement. And this allows us to rely on other academic partners that do not participate in SMART IRB. Lastly, if you're working with a collaborator that's an independent investigator or a community clinic, sometimes we would have to set up what's called an independent investigator agreement. And this is used when that site doesn't have a designated IRB that's responsible for human subjects oversight at that site. So you can see there's various agreements that we can use, and that's why it's important to collaborate with our Reliance team so that we can ensure that we are implementing the agreement that's most appropriate to your research study. A formal request to rely on an external IRB must be submitted in Bruin IRB. This request is made using the same Create New Study button. However, responses to item 4 and 5 on the basic study information page will flag the submission as a request to rely on an external IRB. It's important to note that once a submission is flagged as a Reliance submission, to go back and reverse that requires some background assistance. So questions 4 and 5 have to be considered carefully, and you only answer yes to those questions if you're sure you want to rely on an external IRB. At this point, I'm going to transition to Gerard, who's going to go through some submission tips for your submitting a request to rely on an external IRB.
Hi, everyone. The following are some useful tips for successful external IRB Reliance submission. The initial reviewing IRB notice indicating the approval of the study protocol and consent form template should always be included with the submission. Federally funded research should always include grant documentation in the study funding sources section to allow us to confirm UCLA's involvement in the research. The UCLA compensation for injury language should always be used verbatim. Upon request, references to the sponsor can be removed, and the sponsor may also include additional language noting that they will cover or what they will cover separately from the UCLA language. Sponsor requested modifications to other UCLA template language, such as the commercial value language, the Bill of Rights language, and the UCLA HIPAA authorization statement, may be accepted upon our review. The UCLA template cost language should always be used. If there are any deviations from this template cost language, approval from UCLA coverage analysis, such as an email, should suffice and be included with the submission. Duplicative HIPAA authorization and GDPR language should be removed from the consent forms, and this will be discussed in the next following slides. When revising the UCLA site-specific consent form, sponsor approval of the initial revisions prior to the submission of the Bruin IRB application can prevent excessive back and forth between the UCLA and the sponsor, which would reduce overall review time in the end. In the external IRB section of the application, the reason for Reliance should always include some sort of justification appropriate to the Reliance request. For example, if there is a request to rely on a single IRB that does not automatically qualify for Reliance, as Rebecca discussed earlier, under the UCLA policy, you may note that the sponsor is utilizing a central IRB for all study sites, for example. And make sure that the relying and reviewing IRB is aware of the requested Reliance agreement prior to submission to UCLA. There have been a few instances when a request to rely was submitted without the central IRB having knowledge of the request, and this may cause significant delay as the other institution will have to start the Reliance process from scratch rather than concurrently with UCLA, or may not even agree to enter into a Reliance agreement. Some sponsors provide a pregnancy or pregnant partner authorization rather than a consent form. Since UCLA has the UC HIPAA research authorization form to obtain authorization from participants, these types of documents should be revised to reference a consent form rather than an authorization form, and the HIPAA authorization language should be removed similar to how you do in the main consent form. If a financial interest is identified, please provide either a CERC letter determination or documentation that CERC review is not required. Please note that the entity processing the investigator's financial disclosure will identify potential conflicts of interest and refer to CERC if necessary. The PI can update the application as necessary to note that CERC review is not required. And lastly, recruitment materials are not required for submission when relying on an external IRB. But overall, the principal focus of the local UCLA review is to develop a consent form that addresses UCLA and California requirements. UCLA has developed a checklist to help study teams modify the approved consent template to incorporate local context. Additionally, special attention should be given to the protection of confidentiality section of the consent to ensure that it does not include HIPAA or GDPR disclosures. Next slide, please. Okay, UCLA's request to delete duplicative HIPAA language from the consent form is based on the guidance from the UC Office of Compliance that directs us not to include HIPAA-related language in the consent. Per the HIPAA UCLA FAQ, do not include information about HIPAA in the informed consent form, other than referencing the HIPAA research authorization form. The consent form should not cover the same topics covered in the HIPAA authorization form. This means the ICF will need to be revised to remove this language. A helpful tip is when you are revising the consent forms, it would be helpful to reference the UC HIPAA authorization form when looking at the consent form to revise the confidentiality section to remove any language that is already discussed. Next slide, please. The General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR, is a European Union regulation on information privacy that sets guidelines for collection and processing of personal information from individuals. GDPR is a protection required for the EEA or European Economic Area and consists of member states of the European Union and Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, excluding Switzerland. It is the UC's position that a US-based site for clinical trial, we would not be considered a processor, as we are not collecting or processing data of subjects located in the EU, nor is the institution able to comply with the requirements set forth by GDPR. Discussion of these requirements is not allowed in the consent form. The Reliance team will remove any sections specifically addressing GDPR requirements or discussing terms such as controller, processor, rights for subjects in the EEA, transfer of personal data outside of the United States, or personal data. A separate notice describing the sponsor's responsibilities may be provided to subjects, and reference to that notice may be included in the consent form. But please note that this notice will not be reviewed by UCLA and should not be attached to the UCLA authorized consent form. Next slide, please. The following are documents that may be required to support the request to rely. Reliance agreement documentation. This can consist of electronic signatures via a Smart IRB letter of acknowledgement or LOA, or an IRB authorization agreement or IAA. Online agreements such as the Smart IRB Online Reliance System or IRB Reliance Exchange can be used as well, or master agreements for the commercial IRBs, NCI, CIRB, and StrokeNet do not require a separate Reliance documentation. Local consensus documents can also be reviewed by UCLA as requested by the reviewing IRB. The current reviewing IRB approved study protocol should also be submitted as well. Informed consent documents with the UCLA required template language per the consent form checklist should be included. And lastly, the initial reviewing IRB approval letter indicating the approval of the study protocol and template consent form should be included as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so for requests to rely on a commercial IRB, the process consists of the following. The UCLA PI obtains the protocol, consent template, and commercial IRB approval notice from the sponsor. The UCLA PI will use the approved consent form template to develop a UCLA site-specific consent form, if applicable, using the UCLA Reliance consent form checklist. The UCLA PI creates and submits a request to rely on Bruin IRB per the How to Submit a Request to Rely on Bruin IRB Quick Guide. The UCLA PI will identifies and requests review from any other ancillary committees that require sign-off, such as the ISPRC, MRIC, IBC, CERC, etc., etc. The UCLA local review is performed to finalize a consent form approved for use at UCLA, and then the UCLA Reliance team will then release an external review acknowledgement notice. The UCLA PI will create a request to activate UCLA as a participating site in the commercial IRB's online IRB Reliance submission system and upload the UCLA specific consent form and external review acknowledgement notice. As applicable, the commercial IRB will communicate any unnecessary or necessary edits for the UCLA specific consent form. These will be processed as a modification to your request to rely for sign-off. Lastly, the commercial IRB will issue a final notice approving UCLA as a participating site. This can be retained in the regulatory binder and does not need to be submitted as a modification in Bruin IRB. Next slide, please. For requests to rely on Smart IRB or academic collaborators, the process is slightly different. First, the UCLA PI will confirm with the reviewing IRB that they agree to review for UCLA. The UCLA PI will use the approved consent form template to develop a UCLA site-specific consent form, if applicable again, using the consent form checklist. If not already created by the lead institution PI, the UCLA PI for the study will create a request in the Smart IRB online Reliance system to request to serve as the IRB of record for UCLA. Alternatively, the reviewing IRB can also request or sign an electronic letter of acknowledgement to document the decision to serve as the IRB of record. UCLA will then perform the local review as usual, and once the site-specific consent form is accepted in the by the UCLA consent form, by the UCLA Reliance team, the UCLA PI will submit the UCLA specific consent form to the reviewing IRB for approval. The UCLA Reliance team will then release an external review acknowledgement notice again, with the study condition requiring the reviewing IRB's approval of UCLA as a site and acceptance of UCLA specific consent forms. Please note that the study activities may not initiate until the reviewing IRB approves UCLA as a participating site. The UCLA PI will then create a Bruin IRB modification to upload this approval notice from the reviewing IRB to activate UCLA as a site and acceptance of the UCLA specific consent form. Lastly, the UCLA PI receives modification approval to activate UCLA as a site, and the study condition limiting UCLA's study activities is removed. At this point, UCLA will be fully activated as a participating site. Next slide, please. Collaborative IRBs are strict about maintaining the integrity of the IRB approved protocol and consent form. For this reason, very limited edits are allowed for the UCLA consent form, and generally UCLA is only permitted to add our subject injury language. For collaborative agreements such as NCICRB, StrokeNet, the process is as follows. The UCLA PI will confirm with the reviewing RB that they agree to review for UCLA. The UCLA PI will use the approved consent form template to develop a UCLA site-specific consent form, which typically only includes the insert of the UCLA header and the UCLA research-related injury language. UCLA will perform the local review as usual, and UCLA Reliance will release the external review acknowledgement notice with the UCLA-specific consent form authorized for use at UCLA. If the reviewing RB requires edits to the UCLA-specific consent form, a modification to the UCLA request to rely must be submitted. Lastly, since collaborative agreements are under a master agreement, similar to that of commercial RBs, a separate agreement is not required to be executed for these. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Gerard. Before we go on, I just want to pause quickly to see if there's any questions about those tips or those suggested steps. Some of those steps, for example, the submission of your request to rely on an external IRB, as well as your work with ISPRC or MRC, may happen more concurrently rather than after each other. It's up to you and how you manage your process, but those are the steps that you would need to go through. So if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat, and Gerard and Ryan will monitor those.
Quick question, Rebecca. Could I ask a question?
Of course.
The GDPR, is that a new thing?
It isn't a new thing, but it's something that we're seeing more in the Consent Forms Act, and we're seeing this primarily for industry-sponsored clinical trials. And actually, we're seeing it mostly for clinical trials relying on WCG IRB. It seems that Advara is pulling that language out of consent forms, and so it's going to apply to multinational clinical trials. So sponsor is inserting it appropriately because if the study is running in any part of the EEA, that language has to be in there. But because it doesn't apply in the United States, UC has directed us to either remove it completely or allow it to be presented to participants as part of an appendix that's managed by the sponsor or that's outlined on their website, and that we just refer to that. But it's not something new. It's a regulation that was passed, I believe, in 2022, I believe. Don't quote me on that. But we are seeing it quite a bit in consent forms that are developed by WCG IRB.
Okay. And generally, for most of our purposes, we do not allow it. We have to remove it.
Yes, because it doesn't apply in the United States. So they're outlining protections. And it's basically HIPAA, as we know, is a United States federal regulation. So HIPAA wouldn't apply in EEA. So it's similar to HIPAA, but still very different in terms of things that have to be dictated and spelled out and terminology that's used that just doesn't apply to the United States.
Got it. Quick suggestion. You know how we have that consent form Reliance checklist that we use to modify the ICF templates? There's nothing in there about the GDPR.
No, there's not. Because it's actually in this last year where we have had a larger number of Reliance based on commercial IRBs that we've been seeing this more. For MIRB2, they also see this obviously because oftentimes those protocols and consent templates are developed by a commercial IRB, and then UCLA was reviewing those. So we have addressed this on committees where there's a large number of multinational clinical trials. And we actually are looking at that consent checklist to add a notation about GDPR so you can share that with sponsors. There's some other edits that may be implemented to the injury language based on some recent UC guidance. So we're trying to cover that all at the same time. But that is a good suggestion and something that we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it's also helpful for for us as we do the edits for Gerard and Ryan, so that if I don't see it in the checklist, I don't address it, and then they have to delete it. And so if I see it already, then I can already delete it. Helps a step
It
for your
definitely does.
folks.
It
Yeah,
definitely
yeah.
does.
Okay,
Thank you.
that's all. Thank you.
I've noticed also too that some sponsors are actually including the GDPR as an appendix, because I believe this is something that's being brought up by more than UCLA. So if you see something that's Appendix 1, GDPR or requirements about your personal information, it's not health information, it's personal data. That's definitely a sign that will need to be deleted.
Awesome. Thank you.
Rebecca, we have another question in the chat. Let's see. Is there something I could share with the
question on
sponsor?
the
Oh, sorry. Is there something I can share with the sponsor for what is not reviewed by our RB, like the recruitment materials?
Yes, so we do have the sponsor's memo, the letter to sponsor that can be shared with sponsor that speaks directly to reviews completed by UCLA. But in terms of recruitment materials, sponsors should understand that's a basic element of Reliance, that UCLA is not the IRB of record. So they're not going to be responsible for reviewing recruitment materials. And that's actually a really great transition to this next slide. And something that I think is very important for us to understand as an institution that's trying to make use of Reliance, the best use of Reliance. A request to rely on an external IRB is acknowledged. It's not approved by the UCLA IRB. And the reason for that is because it doesn't undergo an IRB review. So UCLA IRB review is not completing the review required under the criteria for IRB approval for this submission. We're deferring that review to the identified single IRB. If that's a commercial IRB or an academic IRB or whatever IRB we agree to rely on. So we do not have to go through and review and approve recruitment documents or things like that. We authorize a consent form for use at UCLA based on the approved consent template. And that consent form is reviewed for adherence to local UCLA policy, California state laws, and any institutional practices that need to be implemented there. For this reason, the management of post-approval activities, modifications, PARs, and annual review requirements differ greatly from any submission that's approved by the UCLA IRB. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. And if a sponsor has a question about why isn't UCLA, reviewing the recruitment documents, it's because we're relying, and those recruitment documents are reviewed and approved by the single IRB. In the same way that we don't stamp the UCLA authorized consent form, we post it to your request to rely, but we don't stamp it as approved because it doesn't undergo IRB review. Okay. So with that, we wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about other required UCLA reviews. So local context comprises all of our HRPP. So our Human Research Protection Program includes the IRB, as well as all other entities at the institution that help to safeguard and regulate the conduct of human subjects research here at UCLA. So some of these are fairly well known to us. The JCC, ISPRC, and the Scientific Review Committee are entities that ensure that any research that's conducted at UCLA shows sufficient scientific merit, and that we have it's feasible for us to conduct these studies here, and we have sufficient patient population for those studies. You have the safety committees, such as Medical Radiation Safety, Institutional Biosafety Committee, that look at different procedures that may be specific to a protocol to see if there's additional protections or disclosures in the consent that have to be made. The Conflict of Interest Committee is responsible for overseeing all financial disclosures and determining whether they meet definitions of significant financial interest and how those should be managed and disclosed. Office of Human Health Informatics and Analytics is often called into play when we're requesting reports or medical large pools from the medical record or other health data. They want to oversee that and make sure that that's been appropriately consented to and that appropriate authorization has been given or that a waiver has been granted. Coverage analysis is involved with contracting and cost and making sure that things are being billed appropriately for participants. And so these are all committees that have to comment so that we can be sure that a protocol is being conducted appropriately and that subjects are best protected. So the development of that consent form that Gerard went through so carefully and that local context review through the other oversight committees are the primary roles of the Reliance process and that local context review. So that's what we focus on. So for that reason, UCLA will only review amendments that impact UCLA local context, request to revise UCLA consent form template inserts, or may require additional review by one of our other reviewing entities. So this slide highlights the amendments that are required for Reliance submissions. You'll see here that it doesn't say that all IB updates have to be submitted, all protocol updates have to be submitted, all consent form updates have to be submitted. Those are only submitted to UCLA as a modification if they impact radiation procedures or other ancillary committees or changes by any other of our other review committees. And it looks like we have a question. Hamina, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. So I understand when something has to be reviewed by radiation committee because maybe all patients have to get a chest X-ray. So now they want to, make sure is really necessary and whatnot. But yet every study has to go to the scientific review committee, even though we are only the relying IRB. How is that?
Because that's part of UCLA's commitment to only allow research studies that have demonstrated scientific merit and that have been shown to be feasible to be conducted at UCLA. So even though we're deferring the IRB review, so IRB review refers to the criteria for IRB approval, one of those being scientific merit, but that scientific merit can occur at the local level. And as part of our Reliance agreement, we note that we say that UCLA will retain responsibility for assessing the scientific merit and the feasibility of proposed research studies at UCLA. It's part of our commitment to the quality integrity of our research program here at UCLA.
Awesome. I never knew that. That's super good information. Thanks, Rebecca.
That was a very good explanation, Rebecca. This is Mark, but I do want to note that the Scientific Review Committee is separate. That is an institutional policy that was implemented that is independent of the IRB. That is not part of the IRB. That is not the IRB in most cases referring it to the Scientific Review Committee. That is an institutional policy that is required. So that is separate from the IRB. So regardless of who the reviewing IRB is, the Scientific Review Committee requirements would still apply.
Yes. So coming on to that, and this is very specific to clinical trials, but for clinical trials and actually any Reliance study, as part of the agreement to rely, what UCLA is agreeing to is to implement the study as approved by the reviewing IRB. So the reviewing IRB is responsible for considering the scientific protocol and assessing the IRB requirements for approval and human subjects protection, and they approve a protocol. UCLA accepts that protocol as is. The only way we could differ would be if we weren't able to perform a certain aspect of the study because it involves a population we don't see at UCLA or perhaps involves materials that aren't available at UCLA. The other thing could be if they're conducting a part of a study that wouldn't be allowed under California state law or under UCLA policy, we could document that we wouldn't be following that portion of the study. But other than that, we agree to implement the study as approved. So subsequent updates to the protocol, IBs, consent forms that do not impact UCLA local context have to be accepted. For this reason, we don't require a modification for these kinds of updates, but we do want to maintain the history of those updates in the submission. So we have an activity that is specific to Reliance that's called Update Study Details that allows revised documents to be submitted to Bruin IRB. And if a submission is under the oversight of, or is reporting to Encore, that those revised documents will be passed through to the study file in Encore. Again, this upload using Update Study Details is an administrative function to allow upload of future revisions to study documents that would normally not require submission to UCLA IRB as part of the Reliance agreement. The activity is limited to completion to the faculty sponsor PI or PI proxies, and it can be used to upload protocol revisions, IDB revisions, device brochure revisions, or informed consent revisions where there are no edits to the required UCLA template sections. So once we authorize a consent form as acceptable for use at UCLA, you're able to proceed with that as long as there's no edits to the UCLA required template language. So what we put in as part of our local context review, or what you have inserted as part of prepping that consent form using the checklist. Changes to risk of a trial in the informed consent form do not need to be submitted because, again, the responsibility for assessing the risk-benefit ratio is on the reviewing IRB. UCLA defers those determinations to the reviewing IRB. Okay. Similarly, our Reliance agreements say that UCLA will maintain responsibility for overseeing, training, and supervising our local study research personnel. So edits to study personnel other than the PI, because the PI has other implications with contracting or fund management and other responsibilities. Local study personnel other than the PI must be managed using the edit study personnel activity. This does not require a formal modification. It does immediately update the study, and it's an administrative function, and it helps to reduce the frequency and volume of amendments to add, remove, or update the role of study personnel. And this includes co-investigators who will be delegated to obtain informed consent. It should be noted that anybody who's added, so a brand new study personnel that's added, will be required to complete the agree to participate activity. It doesn't have to be completed before that action can be completed and formalized, but it will need to be completed before the submission of any future modification or continuing review. Those submissions will be blocked if that hasn't been completed. Okay, so what we wanted to do, because these are very different concepts for Reliance in terms of amendments, and probably some of the questions that we receive more commonly about Reliance, we wanted to have a couple of questions for you to show your understanding. So this is question 1. Sponsor has forwarded an updated version of the study protocol that incorporates a radiological evaluation that includes an X-ray. A revised ICF that includes mention of the required X-ray and related risk is submitted for review. All edits were reviewed and approved by the central IRB of record. What is your next step? So if you could answer that, we'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, looks like most of you have done that. So very good. So we have the results here. So the majority of you selected the correct answer. This would require a modification in Bruin IRB. And the reason for that being is that the addition of the radiological procedures has to be considered by MRSC. And so a modification will be submitted in Bruin IRB, which will flag the modification for review by MRSC. So because it involves one of our ancillary committees, this is a local context issue, and so it would have to be submitted to UCLA for consideration. So question 2. Launch this question. Sponsor has advised PI and study team of the approval of an IB version 3.0 and corresponding updates to the risk section of the previously approved consent. The updated consent also includes some grammatical and clarifying edits. All edits were reviewed and approved by the Central IRB, the IRB of record. Central IRB has posted the revised ICF that does not revise any of the required UCLA template language. What's your next step? Okay. So let a couple more of you answer. It looks like you're all on track here. So yes, most of you got this correct, that this would be an instance where we would use the update study details function to post the most recent IB and ICF to Bruin IRB. We're going to follow all the instructions regarding any possible reconsent of study participants. Okay. As the updates don't impact the UCLA local context issue, nor revise required UCLA template language, no further review is required by UCLA IRB. Edit study details or update study details will include the updated IB and ICF in the study history, and as applicable, will pass the updates on to Encore. All right, next question. Question 3. A decision has been made to transfer PI responsibility from Joe Bruin to John Researcher. It's not launching. 1 second. Ah, 1 second. Sorry.
I think you have to stop sharing.
Yeah, I did. Okay, thank you. So as from Joe Bruin to John Researcher for a study relying on Central IRB, the IRB of record. Both are faculty members at UCLA who have completed appropriate training, and the study sponsor has been advised and approved the change in PI. What is required to obtain IRB approval for this change? Okay, looks like majority of you, again, are on point here. So yes, this is a case because it's a change in PI. This is something that requires review both by the Central IRB as well as UCLA IRB. The Central IRB's approval should be obtained first and uploaded with your Bruin IRB submission. And under our UCLA Reliance guidance, a modification is required to report any change in PI. Okay, so similarly with PARS, we have different requirements for reporting. Again, because we defer the review, IRB review to that Central IRB, we only require reporting, and for those instances that may require that the UCLA IRB reconsider how the study is being managed locally and whether changes may be indicated. Should information be shared with participants, or even if it's safe to continue the study given the reported event. So we have a link here to our decision tree for Reliance for PARS. And basically what that says is that we only need to know when the study is closed, terminated, or suspended by the reviewing IRB for a specific event, a serious event, or any other local protocol event that requires prompt reporting, including unanticipated problems posing risk to subjects or others, serious or continuing noncompliance, and unresolved participant complaints. And we're missing a bullet here, which I'll add after today's presentation. But because UCLA serves as the privacy board for all Reliance submissions, the privacy board review is not deferred to an outside entity. We also have to consider any events that represent a potential breach of confidentiality or instances where a HIPAA waiver, a HIPAA authorization was not appropriately obtained. So we, in addition to these 3 categories, anything to have to do with possible breach of confidentiality or an inability to obtain appropriate authorization should be reported to UCLA. Okay, so here we have another question here, and this has to do with our help us understand this. Okay, so UCLA is participating in a multi-site study where a participant suicide occurred at a non-UCLA site. Sponsor has issued an investigator memo to advise all participating sites and provided guidance for ongoing monitoring of subject safety. Central IRB, the IRB of record, has reviewed the event and determined that it does not meet the definition of an unanticipated problem involving risk to subjects or others and does not require updates to the consent form. What's your next step? So majority of you are understanding these differences. So the correct answer is no actions required. The sponsor's memo and Central IRB's review determination should be filed in your regulatory binder. And this is because the reviewing IRB has reviewed this event and they've already determined that there is no potential or newly identified risk to subjects. They've taken some actions to help minimize this risk going forward. And so you're going to implement that direction, but you don't need to report that to the UCLA IRB. And then our last question for today. UCLA is relying on a commercial IRB for a multi-site clinical trial. UCLA acts as the privacy board for the research. It was discovered that the study team failed to obtain HIPAA authorization before accessing records at UCLA for research purposes. What is your next step? Very good. Everybody's getting this one right. And the correct answer is both A and B. As a designated privacy board under all Reliance agreements, UCLA is required to review any incidents related to a breach of confidentiality or the failure to obtain authorization or a waiver of the requirement for authorization before accessing records at UCLA. Additionally, such an event would always require reporting to the IRB of record in consultation with the UCLA Office of Compliance. So we would work with the Office of Compliance to help assess the situation and implement a corrective action plan, provide additional training to make sure that we minimize the potential of these events in the future. So it looks like we have quite a few questions. Are there any that we need to, it looks like Savannah, you wanted to ask a question live?
Yeah, I'm so sorry, and because I have to leave in just a second here, but really quick, just to make sure I understand when an amendment to UCLA IRB is required when relying on a central IRB. So I understand that if it affects one of those committees, such as something to do with radiation exposure, but what if, because the example question about the change in the X-ray procedure, but what if it was just like MRI or something that's radiological but not radiation exposing, like the change in the frequency of the MRI assessments, let's say?
Case we wouldn't require review because there would be no requirement for a local context review here at UCLA.
Okay.
So it's only when those local context committees and the list here on this slide, that's the only time you would be required to report to UCLA. So again, because we agree and relying to follow the protocol as approved by the reviewing IRB. So if the reviewing IRB has determined, okay, we're amending the protocol to increase the frequency or to lessen the frequency of these evaluations, we've updated the consent, everything else is as was okayed by UCLA before, then you move forward with that. And you can just use update study details to upload those most current documents there.
Great. Thank you so much.
No problem. Gerard and Ryan, are there questions that would be helpful to address online from the chat?
Yeah, there's a question by Uyen. What needs to be done if the project was suddenly terminated, with UCLA relying on an external IRB? This is hypothetical, but given the climate of research right now, let's say due to funding.
Right. So going back, let's go back to that PAR slide. A termination of the research is something that would need to be reported to both the UCLA IRB as well as the IRB of record. So if it's terminated for cause or for loss of funding or what have you, you would report to both. You always want to report to the reviewing IRB first because we rely on their determination to assess whether additional action is required at UCLA. So when the study's closed, terminated, or suspended, that would require submission to UCLA.
Thank you.
Any other question that you think would be helpful? If not, I'm just going to quickly jump to annual reporting because that's also a difference. Kathleen, did you have a question? You raised your hand. Okay. That's also a difference because we're deferring that IRB review. So for Reliance submission, as you all should be aware now, you aren't required to submit a continuing review on an annual basis to keep the study active. You are still responsible, however, for reporting accrual information and any information pertinent to the continuing review of the overall study to the lead PI. And that lead PI is responsible for reporting to the reviewing IRB on the activities of all the participating sites. In addition, at UCLA, annual assurances must be completed to retain the active registration of the request to rely. You'll receive a reminder at 30, 60, and 90 days prior to the anniversary date. If no response is received, the application will be considered inactive and will be administratively closed. Once administratively closed, all research activities involving human subjects must stop immediately. Additionally, at the completion of your study at UCLA, your request to rely should be closed following the simple study or site closure guidance, which is posted on our Bruin IRB website. This is an administrative activity that closes out the study at UCLA that you can provide to your sponsor, as well as to the reviewing IRB to let them know that the study has been concluded at UCLA. So again, annual reporting is very different for Reliance submissions. So that covers a lot. The majority of our Reliance program is us relying on an external IRB. But as we were discussing in the beginning, we do have quite a few situations where UCLA actually serves as the SIRB. This is often for studies where our investigators develop a protocol and invite collaborations from investigators at other sites. It also applies to situations where UCLA is the primary awardee of a federal grant, and all participating investigators have determined that UCLA would be best to provide that IRB review. So we suggest when you're developing either a multi-center investigator-initiated protocol that you consider these steps. We ask that you consult first with OHRP to confirm that Reliance is possible. We'll look at the source of funding, the size of the study, the complexity, and the oversight that's available for the study at each of the participating sites in making a decision as to whether UCLA is able to serve as IRB of record. Even if we're a federally funded study, UCLA may not always have the resources or the capacity to serve as a single IRB, dependent on these other factors. So it's very important that you consult with us first before reporting that UCLA will serve as that IRB of record. And you can consult with your committee team that you work with regularly for your other submissions, for your other non-Reliance submissions. So your medical committee or your South General or North General Campus Committee, or you can consult with IRB Reliance, and then we will partner with those committee team members to talk about your study and make sure that UCLA serving as IRB of record would be appropriate. You would then obtain IRB approval, UCLA IRB approval through the regular committee process, and which will also consider the oversight of each collaborating site. And once that approval is received, we will begin working with the Reliance team to establish a Reliance agreement, and as necessary, to create a P site submission or participating site submission to activate each participating site. And Ryan's going to help us out here and to walk us through how we go about doing that.
Rebecca,
Yes.
quick question. Would you mind emphasizing the difference between PI assurances and annual assurances for the
Yes,
annual
yes, thank
reporting?
you. Thank you for that reminder. So going back to the annual review reporting side, so I reference here the PI annual assurance. So this is the reminder that you receive 30, 60, and 90 days prior to your anniversary date. This is an annual assurance to keep your study active. There's also an activity in Bruin IRB called the PI assurance activity, and that's what's required at the submission of a new study, the initial submission, that the PI agrees to follow UCLA policies and procedures, provide appropriate oversight to their study team members, et cetera, et cetera. And you also submit that assurance, I believe, at the time of continuing review. So these are different activities, but what's important, if you don't complete your annual assurance and you mistakenly complete the PI assurance, your study is going to lapse and you're going to receive an administrative closure. So you want to be very careful to review the activity buttons and make sure that you're completing the PI annual assurance and not the PI assurance when you receive these reminders to renew. Thank you, Joy. You want to take it from here?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. As Rebecca noted in the previous slide, once UCLA is approved to serve as IRB of record for other sites and the main study is approved, a P-site submission may be created and submitted for the relying sites. Before creating and submitting a P-site or participating site submission, we need to first confirm that the main approved study includes a protocol that identifies all participating sites, as well as listing local site investigators or relying PIs under item 4 of page local study team members. If a P-site is created and submitted before this is completed and reflected on the main Bruin IRB study, we will submit pre-review requests to the study team requesting for these items to be addressed in the main Bruin IRB submission via amendment. Within Bruin IRB, a separate P-site submission, not a standalone modification submission to the main Bruin IRB study, is required for each site engaging with human research participants and relying on the UCLA IRB. To facilitate this, a P-site submission is required for each site requesting to rely on the UCLA IRB and meeting this criteria. Next slide, please. To permit creation of a participating site, Bruin IRB has a function to add relying sites participating in approved research when UCLA is serving as IRB of record. This function is called Add Participating Sites, which you can see pictured on the image on the left-hand side of the slide. Each participating site will be listed and managed separate from the main study application underneath the Sites tab, which is located on the main study dashboard. Within this tab, you can view all created participating sites, no matter what state of submission they are currently in. To document IRB Reliance, the UCLA IRB Reliance team will work with each relying site to determine the appropriate documentation of Reliance or Reliance agreement and create the required documentation or submission within the Smart IRB online Reliance system to document IRB Reliance with these sites upon finalization of the EP site submission. And just a quick note, we do handle Web IRB migrated studies a little bit differently when UCLA is serving as IRB of record. Separate P sites do not need to be created for migrated studies if the collaborator or relying site was already previously approved as an amendment under Web IRB. Only new collaborators for these studies not previously established in Web IRB will require a P site submission. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we're missing a slide. I do have some information I want to go over regarding the P-site application, so I'll cover that real quick before I cover the information for this slide. So before our last slide, I just want to give a brief description of these key sections of information or documentation required within the P-site submission to facilitate our review of the relying site. For example, in page basic site information item 4, We request that you include any site activities the relying site will participate in, or if they're participating in all research activities, you can indicate all. Under page local site documents item 1, if the relying site is consenting or enrolling participants, please make sure to include the local site consent form that will be used by the relying site and is provided as part of their internal IRB reliance review. This will be the UCLA approved template consent form with local site edits as applicable by the relying site. Under page local site documents item 2, please make sure to include any local recruitment documents that will be used by the relying site for UCLA review. And lastly, under item 3 of page local site documents, please provide the copies of the site information sheet and implementation checklist forms that have been reviewed, completed, and signed by the relying IRB staff. These forms are provided to the UCLA study team by the UCLA IRB. It's typically the Reliance team. Sometimes the committee staff may provide these forms, but these are distributed to the UCLA study team to then provide to relying sites. And last slide, please. When creating a P-site submission, the relying PI must be indicated as the investigator under item 2 of the P-site application. This allows us to add the relying PI as a contact and keep them informed of the Bruin IRB process or state of the P-site submission, though they will not have access to the submission directly or our software at all. It's more of just a dummy account to keep the relying PI informed. When creating the P-site submission, if the relying PI is not available for selection, that just means they haven't been added to the system yet and we'll need to add them. To allow the Bruin IRB team to add them, please provide the relying PI institution, name, and email, as well as the main Bruin IRB study ID to the UCLA IRB Reliance inbox. The Reliance team will provide this information to our Bruin IRB support team, who will add them to the system, and the Reliance team will follow back up with the UCLA study team once you're able to add the relying PI into the P-site submission. And next slide, please. I'm sorry, did you want me to share the resources we had, Rebecca?
She may have.
Oh, I think she did
frozen,
freeze.
actually.
So in the slides that we will share with all of our UCLA study team members, there will be helpful links to the NIH. Oh, I lost the slides. We do
They are
have,
disconnected.
I think so. The slides will send you have links to the background of the NIH SIRB mandate, our IRB Reliance page, as well as further guidance and procedures as we've outlined here in this presentation.
And if anyone has any questions at the moment, please feel free to ask. And if we don't know it, we can discuss with Rebecca and then get you an answer via email. Yes, Kimberly.
Hi. I just wanted to know, is there a way to help differentiate between the PI assurances and the annual assurances? I send the tip sheet to all my PIs, but they seem to always struggle. Is there a way to like update the button, like make it more clear that it's only for the annual assurances versus the PI assurances?
We're trying to work with ORIS
Okay.
to update, to actually remove the PI assurance button where it's no longer required. It should only be required at continuing review and initial submission. But it's a customization to Bruin IRB. Another thing we're looking at is possibly, right now, I believe the buttons are right next to each other, and we're trying to separate them out on the list to make it a little bit more clear. But we definitely are looking at that and understand the challenges presented by the current configuration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then she had another question regarding the edit study personnel activity. The other option is not available. It's missing compared to a modification. Is that working as intended, or?
I'm going to have to confirm that. I saw that question. I was trying to confirm on test. And so I'll have to confirm that after, and we'll include that response with the slides.
Okay, Sounds
Okay.
good. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And thank you for your participation. And again, sorry for going over lots to cover today.